This is Chris Lowney, author of Heroic Leadership, and I will talk about an intro segment first. So let me talk a little bit about how I ended up writing the book in the first place. I was a Jesuit seminarian after high school for about half a dozen years, from the time I was 18 until the time I was about 24. The last thing I did as a seminarian was teach economics in a high school, a Jesuit high school. And so when I was looking then, when I decided that my path was not going to be as a Jesuit and I was thinking about what to do next, I didn't have any great master plan. I felt like I needed and wanted some kind of a job. I was teaching economics. I was in New York City. There were big banks with training programs. So I ended up getting a job at JP Morgan, and I worked there for about 17 years and was lucky enough to be able to work in Tokyo, Singapore, London, and New York. And I think when you do two very different things in your life, either you never think about them in the same frame or you think about them a lot. And it used to cross my mind to think about the Jesuits from a corporate lens, so to speak. I mean, we tend to think about Jesuits as a religious group, and most of what's written about Jesuits appropriately is about their spirituality, their history, religious issues, and so on. But I used to think about them with a very different lens. Anybody who works in a big company has this experience that every month somebody gives you another one of these books about leadership or management, and some of them are terrific. And many of them are total junk, you know, and they're very shallow and often even ridiculous. And, you know, you start to feel almost a little bit offended. You know, I'm doing a difficult job, life is very complex, and somebody is giving me this nonsense and telling me this is going to help me figure out how to do a difficult job in a complicated environment well. And, you know, it used to strike me that in many ways, these 16th century Jesuits had very interesting and way ahead of their time approaches for how they did their business, so to speak. You know, for example, if you look at the history of that time, you know, from history, we tend to think of the big companies, quote unquote, of that time as being financial enterprises like the Medici banks or the Fugger banks. And you know, these were tiny enterprises with a few people. Most of them would be Italian. In the case of the Medicis, most of them would be related to each other. They had probably 2 branches outside Italy. And at the same time, you know, there were Jesuits working in dozens of countries in what we today would call developed and emerging markets from many different nationalities. So somehow they figured out how to be a multinational enterprise in the 16th century, a very nationalistic kind of time. Somehow they figured out at a time when Europeans would have thought of people in emerging economies, developing economies as barbarians, civilized, not even human, frankly. You know, they had, relatively speaking, quite an enlightened concept of how to interact across cultures with people who have very different beliefs. And, you know, given the relatively primitive state from our perspective of 16th century technology, they somehow figured out how to communicate well. You know, St. Ignatius told Jesuits that they had to write letters every month or so describing what they were doing, and those letters went to headquarters. But the really ingenious part was that those letters were copied and then circulated all across the enterprise to people in every, what we would say, branch, every school or parish or whatever, people all over the world. And there was no such concept of, you know, knowledge is power and we can't share information. There was no such concept of silos like, well, this one works in education, so he shouldn't give any information to somebody who works in spiritual professions. So it was a very, very different, enlightened, modern approach to doing business. But then at the end of the day, you know, what more so struck me was, well, why did these guys operate this way? Because any textbook today would champion the kind of ideas that I just spoke about, to communicate broadly, to have a one-team mentality, to be truly global and multinational, to try to interact with other cultures. Everybody knows that. The issue is, how are some people manage to get themselves capable of doing that while others can't? And that, I think, gets to a sort of a deeper level of why human beings end up operating the way they do in organizations. And it struck me that Jesuits maybe had 4 best practices, cultural values. They wouldn't have used words like that. To be self-aware, to be ingenious, to be heroic, and to be loving. And those are the 4 ideas, themes that I explored in the book, and the 4 ideas that I'm going to want to talk about a little bit.